On January 5, 1942, as exultant shouts of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet to begin preparations for the second phase of operations in the Pacific War. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and other southern targets convinced him that within a few months, Japanese forces would dominate much of East Asia and the Western Pacific. Yamamoto informed his Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki, that he wanted preliminary plans completed by mid-February. The breathtaking speed of Japan's victories stunned military planners in Tokyo and ignited sharp disagreements within the Imperial General Staff. Militant nationalists argued that Japan should press forward relentlessly while victory was assured, no matter how far afield operations might extend. Another faction, represented most clearly by Yamamoto himself, viewed the situation with deep unease. Yamamoto had never supported the decision to go to war with the United States and Britain, and he worried openly about Japan's long-term prospects. One reason Yamamoto spent so much time at sea aboard the battleship Yamato, the flagship of the Combined Fleet, was that friends within the Navy feared he might be assassinated if he remained in Tokyo. His opposition to an unlimited war with the Western powers was widely known. Even after the war began, Yamamoto's views were no secret. Admiral Ugaki recorded in his diary the need for far-sighted statesmanship following the initial wave of spectacular victories, words Yamamoto often used when warning that Japan could not fight the Western powers indefinitely and expect to prevail. His criticism was directed at political leaders such as Prince Fumimaro Konoe, whom Yamamoto believed had launched the nation into a conflict without fully understanding the kind of war Japan would have to fight. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met his longtime friend Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusaido organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto told him bluntly that war was inevitable because of decisions already made by Japan's politicians. At first, Yamamoto said, Japan would have everything its own way, spreading outward like an octopus extending its tentacles. Now, only a month into the war, that octopus had nearly flattened itself across the Pacific. Yet Yamamoto also warned that this euphoria could not last. The critical moment for political action, he believed, would come with the fall of Singapore. Such a disaster, he predicted, would shake British confidence in India and make London more receptive to peace negotiations. Yamamoto understood the British well. He had served on Japanese delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans intimately, having served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928 and having studied at Harvard earlier in his career. Once war began, Yamamoto believed Japan needed a decisive victory, but after that victory, he estimated Japan would have only 18 months of advantage. A peace settlement, he told Sasakawa, had to be achieved within that window. He relied on Sasakawa to convey this message to influential right-wing leaders in Tokyo. On January 5th, victory seemed close. The American battleship fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk off the Malayan coast. Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite had fallen. Hong Kong had surrendered. Japanese forces were advancing toward the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, and the Solomon Islands. Yet Pearl Harbor had failed to destroy the most important elements of the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carriers. Those carriers, unharmed and at sea, posed a persistent threat. Yamamoto wanted another spectacular success, but he did not expect Singapore to fall for months. When it fell unexpectedly on February 15th, Yamamoto believed Japan's opportunity for negotiation had arrived. But the question remained where Japan should strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's proposal for an attack on the Soviet Union, a land war Japan was ill-prepared to fight while already deeply committed in China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternatives were discussed. Yamamoto favored an Indian Ocean offensive, drawing out and destroying the British Eastern Fleet, then advancing toward the Middle East to link with German forces moving toward the Caucasus oil fields. Control of Middle Eastern oil would solve Japan's most critical strategic problem. The army rejected this plan outright. Another proposal called for an invasion of Australia, capturing New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa to sever America's southern supply line. Yamamoto opposed this as well, believing it would take too long and still fail to deliver a decisive psychological blow against the United States. Yamamoto understood something his opponents underestimated. The Pearl Harbor attack had awakened American resolve rather than shattered it. Even Singapore's fall would not break the United States. Japan needed a victory so devastating that it would compel Washington to negotiate. In January, Yamamoto ordered a new plan drawn up. 2 months later, officers delivered to Tokyo what became known as the MI Plan, envisioning a decisive carrier battle near Midway Island to annihilate the U.S. carrier force. A secondary AL plan called for operations in the Aleutian Islands, potentially opening the way toward Alaska. Success at Midway and in the Aleutians, Yamamoto believed, would give Japan the leverage needed for peace talks.
Despite fierce debate within the Navy Ministry, Yamamoto prevailed. Overlooked were other potentially decisive developments, including the fall of Singapore and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor. Their political value was eclipsed in April by the Doolittle raid, when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 bombers struck Tokyo. The raid shocked Japan's leadership, proving that the United States was far from defeated. When the Midway operation ended in disaster that June, with the loss of 4 fleet carriers, the truth was concealed even from the Army. The scale of the defeat was known only to senior naval leaders. While Yamamoto pursued his Midway gamble, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo continued shifting forces southward, preparing to cut off Australia. Rabaul fell on January 23rd and became a major Japanese air and naval base. Japanese reconnaissance flights and bombing raids intensified across New Guinea and nearby islands. Australian intelligence warned General Douglas MacArthur that New Guinea would soon be targeted. Japan had already bombed Darwin in February. In March, Japanese forces landed at Salamaua and Lae. In May, an invasion force headed for Port Moresby, but was turned back in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although tactically inconclusive, Coral Sea stopped Japan's southward advance. Japan occupied Tulagi in early May and began constructing a seaplane base. The Coral Sea battle convinced Allied leaders that the Japanese push south had to be stopped. MacArthur urged Washington to provide him with carriers and aircraft, but Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, explained that until late June, the U.S. Navy had only 2 operational carriers in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan had 10. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz correctly anticipated the Midway operation, even as Japanese forces continued consolidating positions in the Solomons and New Guinea. Independently of Yamamoto, Imperial General Headquarters ordered Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakikake to prepare renewed advances toward New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, and eventually Port Moresby. Despite Midway, these plans continued unchanged. Allied intelligence detected preparations around Guadalcanal in late May and June. Coastwatchers and intercepted radio messages confirmed that Japanese construction units were building an airfield at Lunga Point. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner recognized the significance immediately. Within weeks, he was assembling an amphibious force in New Zealand. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley assumed command of the South Pacific, despite deep misgivings shared by MacArthur. Both believed an amphibious invasion was premature and dangerously underprepared. Their recommendation to delay the operation was rejected by Admiral King. Time, King insisted, was more dangerous than risk. Intelligence failures plagued the operation from the start. Reports underestimated Japanese air strength at Rabaul and mislocated the Guadalcanal airfield. Supplies were loaded chaotically. There were no reserves. Carriers would remain only briefly. Even so, by late July, 17,000 Marines were moving toward the Solomons. On August 7, 1942, under clearing skies, the first American amphibious invasion of World War II began. Carrier aircraft from Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp struck Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanamboga. Surprise was complete. On Guadalcanal, Marines landed unopposed and captured the airfield. On Tulagi and the neighboring islets, they met fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese naval troops. The fighting on Tulagi was savage and intimate. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Eltson's Marine Raiders faced determined defenders who fought from caves, dugouts, and cliffs. Night brought suicidal counterattacks. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, Marines assaulted fortified hills under murderous fire. Japanese defenders fought to the last man. No quarter was asked or given. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft from Rabaul launched desperate counterattacks. Many bombers were shot down, but Japanese Zero fighters inflicted heavy losses on American aircraft from Enterprise. By August 8th, despite air superiority, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher withdrew his carriers, fearing unacceptable losses. His decision left the invasion force exposed. That night, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a powerful cruiser force south through the slot. Unnoticed due to intelligence failures and missed reconnaissance, his ships closed on the Allied fleet anchored off Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The conditions were set for disaster. By dawn, the Marines held Henderson Field, named for a fallen aviator from Midway. They had won a foothold in the Solomons, but the real battle was only beginning. Guadalcanal would become the turning point of the Pacific War, where Japanese momentum finally broke and the long, brutal road towards Allied victory began. This is the story the history of time remembers, not as legend, but as lived history written in blood, steel, and human resolve.